In a previous lesson, we learned that two events can be dependent or independent. In this lesson, we will practice determining whether two events are dependent or independent. To do this, we will ask the question, does the occurrence of one event affect the probability of the other event? If the answer to this question is yes, then the two events are dependent. If the answer to this question is no, then the two events are independent. Now, in a previous lesson, we looked at these two questions that both involve selecting two balls from a box. In the first question, we are selecting the two balls without replacement, and in the second question, we are selecting two balls with replacement. For both questions, we defined event A as selecting a green ball on the first draw, and we defined event B as selecting a green ball on the second draw. Now, for the question where there was no replacement, we found that events A and B are dependent. For the question where there was replacement, we found that events A and B are independent. In general, you will find that if we are making selections without replacement, then the two events involving different selections will be dependent. Conversely, if we are making selections with replacement, the two events will be independent. Let's examine two more questions. In this question, we are tossing a coin 2 times, and we want to find the probability that both tosses will turn up heads. If we define event A as getting heads on the first toss, and we define event B as getting heads on the second toss, then we want to find the probability that events A and B both occur. At this point, we need to determine whether the two events are dependent or independent. So we'll ask the question, does the occurrence of one event affect the probability of the other event? In other words, if we get a heads on the first toss, will this affect the probability of getting a heads on the second toss? The answer to this is no. The outcome of the first toss has no effect on the outcome of the second toss, so we can say that the two events are independent. And if the two events are independent, we can apply the following formula. Now let's examine a different question. Here we are selecting two people from a group, and we want to find the probability that both selected people will be women. If we define event A as selecting a woman on the first selection, and we define event B as selecting a woman on the second selection, then we want to find the probability that events A and B both occur. To determine whether these two events are dependent or independent, we'll ask the question, does the occurrence of one event affect the probability of the other event? In other words, if a woman is selected on the first selection, will this affect the probability of selecting a woman on the second selection? The answer here is yes. For example, consider these 4 W's and 3 M's as representing 4 women and 3 men. If a woman is selected on the first selection, then for our second selection we see that 3 of the 6 remaining people are women. If a man is selected on the first selection, then for our second selection we see that 4 of the remaining 6 people are women. So the answer to our question is yes. The occurrence of one event does affect the probability of the other event. This means that events A and B are dependent, so we can apply this formula to solve the question. Now, in this lesson, we learned that we can test for independence by asking the question, does the occurrence of one event affect the probability of the other event? If the answer is yes, then the two events are dependent. If the answer is no, then the two events are independent.